Hi everyone, just wanted to finish up lecture from last time we met. So if you recall, we were talking about taxonomy. We were talking about how to group organisms together, and we were talking about grouping organisms based on traits. And before we left, we talked about two types of traits. We talked about ancestral traits, so a quick review. Ancestral traits are traits inherited by two organisms from a relatively distant common ancestor. And I gave you an example of the spine. We can also use for example, all mammals have mammary glands, as we've talked about, and that is an ancestral trait. Then we talked about derived traits. And remember, we said there are two types of derived traits. There are shared derived traits, which is shared between two or more species, and then unique derived traits that are unique to only one species. Well, looking at these traits, we can come up with two systems of classification. And these two systems of classification have often been in competition with each other, but I want to talk to you briefly about them. We talk about classification as gradistic or cladistic. Gradistic classification, as you can see here, are organisms that are grouped together based on the similarity of appearance and shared ancestral traits. Cladistic are organisms that are grouped together based on derived traits. Now, there are a couple ways of looking at this. One is the way I just explained to you. Another way is saying cladistic is grouping organisms together based on evolutionary traits, evolved traits. And the last way, and probably one of the easiest distinctions to make between gradistic and cladistic, is gradistic was an older way of looking at grouping organisms. Cladistic is a newer way. Cladistic uses similarities in DNA, where gradistic does not. It just looks at appearance. One more time. Cladistic looks at similarities in DNA. It looks at genetic relationships between organisms, where gradistic does not. And for the purposes of this class, we're going to be using cladistic classification when we classify different primates in the coming weeks. Another thing to be aware of as far as cladistics is we make what we call cladgrams, where we can show species where they separate based on those derived traits. For example, we have vertebrates, which is an ancestral trait, but we can clad together on derived traits where you can look at cartilage, then you can look at bony vertebrates developing, and slowly kind of bring it down into unique derived traits. Now, the problem with this, it does not really show the time that elapsed between one derived trait and an ancestral trait. Okay, so one more time, let's quickly look at how this can appear when we look at different organisms. When primates, for example, were classified in gradistic classification, gibbons and siamangs were grouped together, orangutans, gorillas, and chimps were grouped together, and us humans, Homo sapiens, we were over here. Now, as time went on, we started to use genetics a little bit more. We found out that we have a lot more in common with gorillas and chimps than we originally thought. So here we see cladistic classification, where gorillas, chimps, and humans are grouped together, orangutans, stan, and gibbons and siamangs. So this is just a tiny example where you can have gradistic and cladistic differences. The last idea of classifying organisms, of looking at grouping organisms I want to talk to you about today, is K-selectivity versus R-selectivity. As you can see right here, we can talk about K-selective species, and K-selective species basically has to do, K-selective and R-selective basically has to do with reproduction. So K-selective species take a longer time to reproduce and have a higher degree of parental care, longer lifespans, generally larger body sizes, and fewer offspring. For example, we are K-selective species, elephants, most mammals are K-selective species. And then on the other end, we have R-selective species. R-selective species takes a shorter time to reproduce, not very much parental care, usually shorter lifespans, smaller body sizes, and have many, many, many offspring. For example, insects, rodents, fish. Now, two things to be aware of between K-selective and R-selective. One is that this is not an either-or. There's a sliding scale. A species can be either more R-selective or less R-selective, more K-selective, and so forth. One more thing to be aware of is K-selective species do better in a stable environment, where R selector species do better in a changing environment. So when an environment is tumultuous, it's rapidly changing, R selector species do a little bit better as far as fitness. K selector species do better when the environment is more stable. All right, this concludes our lecture for today. Have a good day.